The child was crying the way a match cries when it first tastes fire, small at the beginning, almost polite, as if asking permission to exist. Then the sound sharpened. It split the air. It turned every adult face into a wall. The station did not answer. It was winter, and the war had ended the way storms end. Not with peace, but with debris. The ceiling was still intact, but the walls wore soot-like bruises. A clock hung above Platform 3 with its hands stuck at 2:17, as if time itself had flinched and refused to go on. Men in patched coats moved like shadows that had forgotten their owners. Women carried bundles tied with rope, their fingers red and cracked. Everyone had learned the same arithmetic. A suitcase is a future, an empty hand is a sentence. And on the cold stone floor beside a wooden bench, wrapped in a blanket too thin to be called protection, was a little girl. Her cheeks were wet, her lips were pale, her eyes were wide in the terrible way children's eyes become when they stop believing that adults automatically know what to do. No one stopped. They looked past her as if the crying were part of the station's machinery, like the squeal of brakes, like the hiss of steam, like the low moan of wind searching for cracks in the glass. A tall man in a worn army coat stepped off a late train and stood still. Not because he was stunned by the noise, but because his body still hadn't learned the difference between danger and ordinary life. His name, his real name, was Jonah Mercer, though no one in the station knew it, and for years, fewer and fewer people would. He held a small canvas bag. That was all. No medal on his chest. No family waiting at the gate. Just a scar near his left eyebrow, and the stiff posture of someone who had spent too long listening for mortars. He stared at the child. He had walked past bodies before. He had stepped over them, apologizing in his head, because the living had to keep moving. But this was not a body. This was a life still insisting. Jonah took one step, then stopped again, because stopping was dangerous, and he had survived by not stopping. He told himself the obvious thing: someone will help her. There were dozens of people here. Surely the world still contained at least one pair of hands not too exhausted to lift a child. Then he watched a woman adjust her scarf, glance down at the girl, and turn away. A man with a briefcase stepped around the blanket with a practiced stride. Two soldiers in uniform, fresh, clean, newly assigned to peace, walked by with eyes forward as if crying were a discipline they were forbidden to acknowledge. Jonah's throat tightened, not with pity, with something darker, recognition. He had seen this before, not in a station, but in the moments after shelling, when the air was full of dust and choices. People would look at someone bleeding and walk away because they had no bandages left, no time left, no faith left. It was never cruelty. It was survival, but a child should not have to pay for that. Jonah moved. He knelt beside the blanket. His knees cracked softly, like a door opening in a house that had been abandoned too long. The girl flinched at first, as if she expected a hand to strike, not to help. "It's okay," he said, and hated how thin his voice sounded. He had spoken loudly to men in trenches. He had shouted commands. But to a child, his words felt like a stranger's breath in the dark. Her crying did not stop. It only changed shape, becoming ragged, uneven. She stared at him, as if measuring him, as if deciding whether this was another adult who would vanish. Jonah glanced around, searching for someone who looked like a mother, a father, an older sister, anyone whose eyes mirrored hers. No one met his gaze. He saw a guard at the far end of the platform. The guard was speaking to a clerk. Their voices were bored, ordinary. Jonah walked over with the child still on the floor and said, "There's a child here alone." The guard looked at him, then at the girl, then away, as if her loneliness were a stain he didn't want on his hands. "We've had dozens," the guard muttered. "Refugees, orphans. People leave them when they run. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they don't." Jonah's heart thudded once, hard, decisive. "What do you do with them?" The guard shrugged. "We file a report. We send them to the parish shelter if there's room, or to the county office if they're taking cases today. If not..." The guard lifted his hands in a helpless gesture that was too familiar. "If not, they stay until someone claims them." Jonah looked back at the child. Her blanket had slipped, exposing small shoes with frayed laces. Her hands were clenched as if holding on to air. "How long has she been here?" "Since morning." The guard's voice softened a fraction. "She won't tell her name." Jonah returned to the girl and crouched again. "Hey," he said gently, "what's your name?" She stared at him. Her mouth trembled. "No name?" he asked, keeping his tone light, like he was asking about the weather. Not even a little one? She shook her head. The motion was so slight he almost missed it. Jonah swallowed. Names were power. Names were safety. Without a name, a child could be moved like cargo. Without a name, a child could disappear legally and emotionally at the same time. He tried again. Where's your mother? The child's eyes shifted to the crowd. She looked, really looked, as if searching for a face she had memorized. Then her gaze fell, and she shook her head again. Jonah felt something inside him begin to split. The part that still believed in clean lines, right and wrong, soldier and civilian, war and peace, and the part that had been shaped by ash and compromise. He could leave. He could tell himself he had done enough by alerting a guard. He could walk out of the station and become one more man trying to rebuild a life. But the girl's crying followed him, even in his imagination, like a thread tied around his wrist. Jonah reached into his bag and pulled out a stale piece of bread wrapped in cloth. He offered it. The child stared at it as if it might be a trick. He tore off a small piece and ate it himself, chewing slowly to prove it was safe. Then he offered the rest again. Her fingers moved, tiny, hesitant, and took it. She bit carefully, as if afraid the bread might vanish if she trusted too hard. Jonah exhaled. It was not relief. It was surrender. The guard returned with a clipboard. If you're involved, he said, we'll need to write your name as the one who found her. Jonah looked at the pen. A pen should not feel like a weapon, but in that moment it did, because he understood something that most people never had to understand. Writing a name could be a kind of marriage. It could bind two lives with ink. It could turn compassion into responsibility and responsibility into a lifetime. The guard tapped the paper. Full name. Jonah stared at the line where the letters would go. His mind flashed to his own past, blurred faces, a burned house, a mother's hands, a father's absence, the war swallowing the rest. He had no one left who would come looking for him. If he vanished, the world would not miss him the way it would miss a child. He looked at the girl again. Her mouth was still wet with tears and bread. Her eyes impossibly were watching him, waiting as if she knew this was the moment adults decided whether she mattered. Jonah's hand tightened around the pen. He could sign his true name, or he could do something far more dangerous. Give her a name by giving up his own. His heart beat once, loud and final. Jonah leaned over the clipboard and began to write, and the ink moved like a door opening into a life he had not planned to live. The pen hovered above the paper, the way a man's hand hovers above a trigger, steady, trained, and terrified of what comes after. Jonah Mercer felt the station tilt, not from the cold or exhaustion, but from the weight of a single blank line. Full name of guardian, reporting party. The guard's clipboard smelled of cheap ink and bureaucracy. Paper, in that era, was not just paper. It was permission. It was a border. It was the thin wall between a child becoming a citizen or becoming a ghost. Behind Jonah, the station kept breathing. Boots scuffed stone. A train screamed and vanished. People moved as if movement itself were their last remaining religion. The little girl sat on the floor beside the bench, wrapped in her thin blanket, chewing bread with the careful seriousness of someone who had learned that food could disappear. She no longer cried, but her silence was not calm. It was a waiting room inside her chest. Jonah's eyes dropped to her shoes again. The frayed laces, the two big toes, the kind of shoes bought in a hurry by someone running out of time. The guard cleared his throat. Sir? Jonah looked up. If I sign, he said, what happens next? The guard's face did not soften. His job could not afford softness. We take her to the county office. They'll try to identify her. If you're not family, they'll still ask you to provide statements, where you found her, how long you've known her, why you're claiming responsibility. And if I don't sign? The guard's gaze flicked to the child, then away. Then she goes into the system. He said it like one says weather. Jonah knew what the system meant in a country still cleaning blood out of its gutters. Shelters were full. Paperwork was slow. Children could be moved 5 times before anyone learned their face. And the smallest ones, those who could not speak clearly, who could not defend their own memories, vanished first. Jonah's fingers tightened around the pen. He had survived war by understanding a cruel principle. If you don't choose, the world chooses for you. And the world, left to itself, always chose the easier thing, the colder thing. He lowered the pen again. His own name waited in his throat. Jonah Mercer. 14 letters. A life. A past. But names were not only for introductions. Names were keys. They unlocked records and debts. They opened doors and also locked them behind you. If he wrote Jonah Mercer, he would be bound to this child publicly. Every office, every form, every checkpoint. His real identity would now be tied to a girl with no documents. The state would inspect him like a cracked coin. It would ask where he lived, where he was born, where his family was. It would ask questions Jonah could not answer cleanly anymore, because the truth, the full truth, was a shattered mirror. His birth records were gone, his town burned, his mother dead, his father unknown, his own discharge papers stained with an administrative error that still hadn't been corrected. He was already half a man in the eyes of government, and yet he could not leave her. His gaze drifted past the guard to a poster on the station wall, peeling at the edges. It showed a smiling family under bright skies, a slogan about rebuilding. The poster looked like a lie told with clean teeth. Jonah exhaled slowly, and his mind did the one thing it always did when fear rose. It searched for strategy. There had been a man in his unit, quiet, hard-working, named Elliot Shaw. Elliot had not made it home. Jonah remembered the night, rain, shouting, the flash that erased part of the sky. Elliot's dog tags had been collected. His pack, too. Jonah had carried Elliot's letters to the field office because there was no one else. Elliot Shaw was dead. But Jonah also remembered something else. Elliot had been an only son. No wife, no children. No one in any office would be waiting for him. No one would come to contest his existence. A dead man with no ties is the safest identity in a broken world. Jonah felt sick at the thought. It was theft, no matter how he dressed it up. A name was the last thing a fallen man owned, but a child with no name owned nothing at all. The little girl looked up at him, as if she felt his hesitation in her bones. Jonah knelt beside her. "Hey," he murmured, forcing his voice into steadiness. "I'm going to ask you something. You don't have to answer if it's scary." Her eyes were the color of winter river stones, gray-blue, cold at the surface, deep underneath. He pointed gently to her chest. "Do you know what people called you?" She blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed. A sound trembled at the back of her throat and died before it could be born. Jonah swallowed. "Okay," he whispered. "That's okay." He sat back on his heels and took the smallest risk he had ever taken. He said softly, "Would you like a name?" The child stared at him, her brow knitted, confused by the question, as if she had never been offered something that belonged only to her. Jonah's chest tightened. He had seen hunger and cold and fear. But this was the kind of deprivation that left no bruises, the kind that hollowed the soul quietly. He reached into his bag again and pulled out a small object, a wooden button from his coat carved with a simple star. He'd kept it as a charm, a stupid superstition soldiers clung to when life was mostly chance. He placed it in her palm. "This is yours," he said. "No one can take it unless you let them. Understand?" Her fingers curled around it. The star disappeared inside her fist. For the first time, she seemed to breathe as if she owned the air. Then, barely audible, she spoke. Not a full name, not even a word an adult would trust. Just a sound. "Mara." Jonah froze. "Mara?" he repeated gently. The child nodded once, like someone agreeing to a truth that might hurt later. Mara. It did not matter whether it was her birth name or a name she had invented to survive. It was a hook, a thread, a way to call her back when she drifted. Jonah rose slowly and returned to the guard's clipboard. The guard tapped the line again, impatient. "Sir, we don't have all day." Jonah stared at the blank space and felt his life split in two. On one side, the man who could still belong to himself. On the other, the man who would belong to a child. He wrote carefully, as if the letters might cut him. Elliot Shaw. The ink went dark, permanent, quietly violent. The guard nodded, satisfied, and turned to the next section. Relationship to child? Jonah's throat tightened. He could not write stranger. It would invite scrutiny. It would invite delay. Delay was where children disappeared. He wrote the word that was half lie, half vow. Father. The guard's eyes flicked up. "She's your daughter?" Jonah did not answer immediately. He glanced at Mara. She sat very still, clutching the carved star button in her fist, watching him, as if his next word would decide whether the world had a floor. "Yes," Jonah said. The word hit his mouth like a stone. The guard made a sound, neither approval nor disbelief, just routine, and began filling out the rest. "Date of birth?" Jonah hesitated. "I don't know. The guard's pen paused. "You don't know your own child's—" "I found her today," Jonah said quietly, and let the truth peek out just enough to sound human. "She's been through something. I'm trying to do this right." The guard studied him. Jonah knew that look. It was the look of a man deciding whether to be strict or merciful. Finally, the guard sighed. "We'll estimate. County will adjust if records show up." Jonah nodded once, grateful and ashamed at the same time. The guard tore off a copy and handed it to Jonah. "You'll come with us to the county office. They'll take statements. They'll assign a case number." Jonah held the paper. Elliot Shaw, father, a dead man's name warmed by a living child's hand. Mara stood unsteadily when Jonah offered his arm. She did not take his hand, not yet, but she walked close enough that her blanket brushed his coat. Outside, the wind knifed through the streets, carrying the smell of coal and old sorrow. Jonah looked down at the child beside him and understood, with a clarity that almost hurt. From this moment on, every question asked about her would also be asked about him, and every answer would pull him deeper into a life built on one unforgivable lie, for the sake of one redeeming love. At the corner, Mara glanced up at him, her lips parted. "Papa?" she whispered, testing the word like a fragile glass. Jonah's breath caught. "Yes," he said, voice cracking. "Yes, I'm here." And as they walked toward the county office, the paper in Jonah's pocket felt heavier with every step, like a stone he would carry for years, not because he was punished, but because he chose to be. The county office did not look like a place where love could survive. Its windows were narrow, its walls the color of old bone, and the air inside carried the damp odor of paper that had been handled by too many desperate hands. The waiting room was full of people who sat close to each other without touching, families broken into quiet fragments, men with caps pressed into their knees, women staring at the floor as if the tiles might offer an answer. Jonah, Elliot Shaw now, on paper, stood with Mara at his side and felt the first true sting of what he had done. In the station, the lie had been ink. Here, it had become architecture. A clerk behind a counter looked up with eyes that had seen too much grief to be surprised by any of it. "Next," she called, without lifting her voice. Jonah stepped forward. His boots squeaked faintly on the waxed floor. Mara stayed half a step behind him, her blanket drawn up around her shoulders like a shield. The clerk's gaze flicked to Jonah's form. "Name?" Jonah's tongue hesitated, then surrendered. "Elliot Shaw." The sound did not fit his mouth. It tasted like borrowing a coat that still carried another man's scent. The clerk wrote it down as if she were recording the weather. "And the child?" Jonah looked down at Mara. "Mara," he said. The clerk's pen paused at the unfamiliarity of it. "Last name?" Jonah felt the floor sway again. Last names were not decoration. They were chains. They were lineage. They were proof. He heard his own heartbeat. He heard the soft shiver of Mara's breath. "Shaw," Jonah said. The clerk's pen scratched. "Mara Shaw." It appeared on paper like a verdict and a blessing in the same breath. The clerk slid a form across the counter. "Sign here, and initial at the bottom." Jonah took the pen. His fingers were steady, the soldier's steadiness, but inside something trembled with the knowledge that each stroke made the lie more real and the truth more unreachable. He signed, "Elliot Shaw." The clerk tore off a carbon copy and stamped it twice. The stamp landed with a sound like a door slamming. "Sit," she said, pointing at the benches. "A caseworker will call you." They waited. Time in that room did not move like ordinary time. It thickened. It pooled. It made minutes feel like hours and hours feel like an entire past. Mara sat very still, her small hand clenched around the wooden star button Jonah had given her. Her eyes tracked faces, doors, uniforms, as if trying to memorize the shape of danger. Jonah kept his posture straight. He had learned in war that people trusted straight backs. A man who looked confident was questioned less, but his mind ran in tight circles. What if someone recognizes the name? What if Elliot's unit files records? What if a clerk cross-checks and finds a death notice? What if Mara says something that doesn't match? He reached into his coat pocket, fingers brushing the paper he had received at the station. The ink on it felt hot, like it might burn through cloth. A door opened. A woman stepped out. She wore a gray cardigan and carried a folder thick with forms. Her hair was pinned back in a severe knot. She was not old, but her face had the tired patience of someone who dealt with human tragedy for a living. "Mr. Shaw?" she called. Jonah rose. "Yes." Mara did not stand until Jonah offered his hand. His real hand, not the borrowed name. She hesitated, then slid her fingers into his palm. Her hand was cold. The caseworker led them down a hallway where the walls were lined with framed notices and official warnings. The building seemed constructed not to comfort, but to categorize. They entered a small office with one desk, 2 chairs, and a narrow window that showed nothing but a brick wall. The caseworker sat, opened her folder, and looked Jonah in the eyes. Her gaze was calm but sharp, like a needle. "I'm Ms. Harriet Doyle," she said. "I handle emergency guardianship cases. I'll ask you some questions. Answer as accurately as you can." Jonah nodded. "Of course." Harriet Doyle glanced at Mara, then back at Jonah. "How old is she?" Jonah swallowed. "I'm not sure. 4, maybe 5. Harriet's pen hovered. "You're not sure?" Jonah forced his voice into the right shape. Ashamed, but sincere. "It's been chaotic." She's not speaking much. Harriet looked at Mara. "Can you tell me how old you are, sweetheart?" Mara's fingers tightened around Jonah's hand. She looked at Harriet, then down at the floor. Her lips parted, but no words came. Harriet's expression softened slightly. Not kindness, exactly, but recognition. She had seen fear that deep before. "Does she know her mother's name?" Harriet asked Jonah. Jonah's mind flashed with the station, the woman who adjusted her scarf and turned away. The guard's shrug. He shook his head. "No, she only said Mara. That's all I got." Harriet wrote something, then lifted her gaze again. "Where is the child's mother?" Jonah chose the simplest truth. "I don't know." "And her father?" Jonah's chest tightened. He could have said, "I don't know," again. But something about the way Mara's hand clung to his made him feel the cruelty of that answer, even if it was true. "I'm here," Jonah said quietly. "I'm her father." Harriet held his gaze for a long moment. "Mr. Shaw," she said, careful, "I need to be clear. Claiming a child without documentation is serious. It carries legal consequences. Are you certain?" Jonah nodded. "Yes." The word was not just a lie. It was a decision. Harriet leaned back, studying him. "Where do you live?" Jonah named the room he rented above a closed bakery on Hawthorne Street. It was cheap, cold, and smelled faintly of yeast that would never rise again. But it had a door that locked. "Do you have steady employment?" Harriet asked. Jonah hesitated, then said, "I do odd jobs, dock work, repairs, whatever I can find." Harriet's pen moved. "Any history of violence, charges?" Jonah met her eyes. "No." There was a silence, brief but heavy, like a stone dropped into water. Harriet tapped the folder. "We'll need to register her for temporary placement. If you claim guardianship, you'll be required to provide basic care, schooling, and medical checkups. There will be follow-up visits." Jonah's pulse quickened. Visits meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant risk. But sending Mara into the system meant losing her. Harriet slid another form across the desk. "Temporary guardianship. Sign here. This gives you legal authority to make decisions for her until we locate relatives or official records. If no relatives are found within 6 months, the court may consider permanent guardianship." 6 months. Jonah felt the number settle in his bones like a sentence. He picked up the pen. His hand did not shake. He signed, "Elliot Shaw." Harriet stamped the paper. Again, that sound, a door slamming. Then she said, "All right." Her voice shifted into something almost human. "Bring her here." Mara stiffened. Jonah squeezed her hand gently. "It's okay," he murmured, though he did not know if it was. Harriet guided Mara to a small table where a camera on a tripod waited. "We need a photograph," she explained softly, "for the file. Just look at me, sweetheart." Mara stared at the camera as if it were a weapon. Harriet waited, patient. Mara's eyes flicked to Jonah. Jonah stepped closer, kneeling so his face was level with hers. "Just one picture," he whispered. "Then we go home." Mara's mouth trembled, but she nodded, barely. The camera clicked. The flash lit the room for an instant, bleaching everything white, like a memory being forced into existence. Harriet wrote again, then stood. "You can take her now. Go to the clinic across the street for a basic exam. After that, you may return home." Home. Jonah felt the word twist inside him, complicated. Home was not a place. It was a person, and he had just built one out of paper and courage. He took Mara's hand and walked out into the hallway. She stayed close, her small steps quick to match his. In his pocket, the guardianship form pressed against his leg, a dead man's name, a living child's future. Outside, the winter sky was flat and colorless. But when Jonah looked down, Mara's fingers were still wrapped around his, and in that grip, he understood something that had terrified him more than any battlefield. He was no longer pretending to be her father for the paperwork. He was becoming her father for real. They did not go home the way people with certainty go home. They went the way the newly responsible move, carefully, measuring each step, as if the ground might change its mind. Jonah held Mara's hand through streets that smelled of coal smoke and thawing refuse. The city was trying to remember itself after the war, but memory is a stubborn thing. It does not heal just because time asks politely. The clinic sat across from the county office like a reluctant twin. Inside, a nurse checked Mara's pulse, peered into her ears, listened to her breathing. Jonah stood where he could see everything. He had learned that vigilance was a kind of love. "She's underweight," the nurse said, not unkindly. "But she's strong." "Strong." Jonah nodded, as if strength were something that could be weighed and charted. Mara did not cry. She endured, the way children do when they have already learned that crying costs energy and rarely buys relief. When they stepped back into the street, the sky had shifted to a dull pewter. Snow threatened, then thought better of it. "Hungry?" Jonah asked. Mara nodded. He took her to a small diner with fogged windows and chipped mugs. It was not a place for families. It was a place for men who ate fast and left tips they could afford. Jonah ordered soup and bread. He watched Mara lift the spoon with both hands, careful not to spill, as if each drop mattered. It did. When she finished, she pushed the bowl away and looked at him with the solemn concentration of someone assembling a new rule. "Home?" she asked. Jonah paused. The words still felt like an exposed nerve. "Yes," he said, and paid. The room above the bakery was colder than he remembered. The stairs creaked with each step, protesting the addition of small feet. Jonah unlocked the door and stepped aside to let Mara enter first. The room was spare. A narrow bed, a table, a chair, a small stove that hissed more than it heated. Dust lay in corners like something that had given up. Mara stood in the doorway, clutching her blanket. "This is it," Jonah said, unsure whether to apologize or reassure. She took 3 steps in, then stopped. Her eyes moved from the bed to the table to the window. She pressed her palm against the wall, testing its reality. Jonah set his bag down and knelt. "We'll make it warmer," he said. "We'll fix things." Mara nodded, as if she understood promises only when they were spoken quietly. That night, Jonah slept on the floor. He spread his coat beneath him and gave the bed to Mara. He lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of shared breathing. Each time she shifted, he lifted his head, ready to respond to a nightmare that did not come. Morning brought light in the color of old milk. Jonah rose early, washed his face, and dressed. He boiled water and poured it over grounds he'd reused too many times. He watched Mara wake, her eyes opening to him with a question that made his chest tighten. "Papa?" she said, not asking, not telling, testing. "Yes," Jonah answered. He would answer that way every time, until the words settled into them both. The days that followed arranged themselves into a rhythm born of necessity. Jonah found work where he could, hauling crates at the docks, fixing a door for a grocer, mending a roof with borrowed tools. He learned to time his hours so he could be home when Mara woke and again before dusk. He learned to cook, simply. He learned to listen. Mara spoke little, she watched. She memorized his habits, the way he tied his boots, the way he counted coins before buying bread, the way he paused before answering questions that brushed too close to danger. Once, she pointed at his scar. "Hurt?" "A long time ago," Jonah said. "Still?" He considered. "Sometimes." She nodded, satisfied. The lie, the name, began to demand its rent. At the employment office, Jonah signed Elliot Shaw again and again. At the clinic, at the school registry, at the grocer's ledger. Each signature pulled him farther from Jonah Mercer and closer to a man who had died believing in something simpler than survival. He learned to answer to Elliot. He learned to carry Elliot's age, Elliot's hometown, Elliot's empty family tree. He learned the sound of his own voice lying without malice. At night, when Mara slept, Jonah took out the papers and read them by the weak light of a lamp. Guardianship, temporary placement, follow-up visit. Each word was a nail. Together they built a structure he could not dismantle without collapsing the life inside it. On the 4th week, a letter arrived. County Office of Child Welfare follow-up visit scheduled. Jonah read it twice, then again. A woman would come. She would ask questions. She would look into cupboards and closets. She would listen for inconsistencies. The lie would be tested not by cruelty, but by thoroughness. Jonah folded the letter and put it away. He did not tell Mara. He did not need to. Children sensed approaching weather long before clouds gathered. He cleaned the room that night. He fixed the stove. He borrowed a second chair. He learned the school's hours and walked Mara there the next morning, hand in hand. The school smelled of chalk and damp wool. The teacher smiled too brightly and asked too many questions. Jonah answered what he could. When the teacher asked about Mara's mother, Jonah said, "She's not with us." It was the truth, cut small enough to pass. Mara learned letters quickly. She traced them with care. She learned to write her name last. Mara Shaw. The letters looked right on the page. Jonah watched from the doorway, pride and fear braided tight in his chest. On the day of the visit, Jonah rose before dawn. He dressed Mara in the cleanest clothes he owned. He set bread on the table. He wiped the window. Ms. Harriet Doyle arrived at 9, her gray cardigan unchanged. She looked around the room with the same measured gaze she had used in the office. "You've made improvements," she said. Jonah nodded. "We're managing." She spoke with Mara, asked about school, about food, about sleep. Mara answered in short sentences, her eyes flicking to Jonah as if checking the ground beneath her words. Harriet watched the exchange. She wrote notes. Finally, she closed her folder. "I'll schedule another visit in 3 months," she said. "If no relatives come forward, the court will consider next steps." Jonah thanked her and saw her out. When the door closed, he leaned against it and breathed. Mara approached and pressed her forehead into his coat. Jonah rested his chin on her hair. That night, as snow finally fell, Jonah understood the full shape of what he had done. He was not simply borrowing a name. He was borrowing a life. Every day, every choice, so that a child could grow inside it without falling through the cracks. He did not know how long he could keep the lie standing. He only knew he would try because trying was the only inheritance he had left to give. Winter folded into spring without ceremony. Snow thinned into slush, slush into mud, and the city learned again how to breathe without flinching at every sound. Jonah measured the season by smaller signs. Mara's shoes drying faster by the stove, the light lasting longer at the window, the way her shoulders no longer tensed when doors closed. It was during this loosening of the world that Mara began to ask questions. They arrived quietly, like mice in the walls, soft, persistent, impossible to ignore once you knew they were there. She asked about names first, why people had 2, why hers looked so careful on the page, why his looked older than his face. Jonah answered what he could. Names were gifts, names were promises, names were how people found each other in crowds. He chose truths that did not point too sharply at the missing center. Then, one evening, while the kettle sang and the bread browned, Mara asked the question Jonah had been circling since the station. "Where's my mama?" The word landed between them like a cup set down too hard. Jonah felt his breath pause, the way it had in trenches when a sound meant danger. He turned the kettle off. Steam thinned into silence. He knelt so they were eye to eye. "She's not here," he said. Mara waited. She had learned that answers sometimes came in layers. Jonah considered the lies available to him. He could say she died, the cleanest blade, the one that cut and cauterized at the same time. He could say she left, the cruelest truth in a child's language. He could invent a story with distance and grace, and no fingerprints. He chose none of them. "She loved you," he said instead. Mara frowned, assembling the words as if they were blocks that did not quite fit. "Then why not here?" Jonah closed his eyes for half a second. He opened them and said the thing that had cost him the most to keep intact. "I don't know." It was the only lie he refused to tell. Mara studied his face, searching for seams. She did not find them. Children are ruthless in their honesty. They sense when adults hide to protect themselves. This felt different. This felt like an adult standing still because movement would do harm. "Did she know my name?" Mara asked. Jonah nodded. "I think she did." "Did she know you?" Mara's voice was careful now, the way people speak near edges. Jonah let the truth be small enough to hold. "No, not like this." Mara pressed her lips together. She did not cry. She had cried enough for a lifetime already. Instead, she looked down at the wooden star button on the table, tracing its edges with her finger. "Can you tell me about her?" she asked. Jonah's chest tightened. Telling would require inventing. Inventing would be theft of another kind. He chose again. "I can tell you what I know," he said. "I can tell you what I imagine, and I can tell you what I promise." Mara looked up. "Promise? That you are not alone," Jonah said. "That you are wanted. That whoever brought you into this world did not mean for you to disappear." Mara absorbed this. She nodded once, slow. That night, Jonah lay awake listening to rain begin and end in fits. He felt the shape of the question settle deeper, like a stone dropped into water. He understood then that the danger was not only discovery by offices and clerks. The danger lived here, in the daily human hunger for origins. In the weeks that followed, Mara asked about fathers, about how they worked, about whether they stayed, about whether they always told the truth. Jonah answered carefully. He said fathers were people, not rules, that they failed and tried again. That truth mattered, but so did timing, that some truths were seeds and needed the right season. "Do you tell the truth?" Mara asked one morning as he tied his boots. Jonah paused, the lace taut between his fingers. "I try." "Always?" she pressed. He looked at her and felt the knife edge of it. "I try to tell the truth in ways that don't break things." Mara considered this. "Like cups?" "Yes," Jonah said, relieved. "Like cups." School brought new questions. A boy asked why Mara's father looked different from the fathers at the gate. A girl asked where Mara's mother was during the recital. The teacher asked Jonah to bring paperwork he did not have. Jonah learned to deflect without hardening. He learned to say later. He learned to say, "We're working on it." He learned the grace of incomplete answers. The lie, the name, continued to exact its quiet price. Letters arrived addressed to Elliot Shaw. Notices, a reminder about civic registration, a request to update employment records. Each envelope felt like a hand reaching into his pocket, counting what was there. Jonah kept a ledger now, not of money, but of risk. What he could say, what he must not, what he could postpone. He lived inside margins. One afternoon, Mara came home with a drawing. It showed a house, crooked and earnest. Two figures stood outside it, holding hands. One was taller. Both were smiling. Jonah pinned it to the wall. "That's us," Mara said. "Yes," Jonah said. She tilted her head. "Where's Mama?" Jonah felt the question open again, gentler this time, like a door left ajar. "Sometimes," he said, "people live in stories before they live in houses." Mara nodded. "Can she live in a story?" Jonah's eyes burned. "If you want her to." That night, Jonah began something he did not name. After Mara slept, he sat at the table and wrote. He wrote not a biography, not a lie, but a collection of moments. A woman who loved rain, a woman who sang softly, a woman who held a child with careful hands. He did not claim these were facts. He did not sign them. He folded the pages and put them in a box beneath the bed. He told himself it was a bridge, not a replacement. Mara found the box weeks later. She did not open it without asking. When Jonah nodded, she read slowly, her finger tracing the lines. "Is this her?" she asked. "It's a way to think about her," Jonah said. Mara smiled, small and fierce. "I like her." Jonah felt something loosen that he had been holding since the station. The follow-up letter came the next day. County Office of Child Welfare Review scheduled. Jonah folded it and placed it in the ledger. He did not tell Mara yet. He would choose the moment, the way he had learned to choose words, carefully, for strength, not for escape. That evening, Mara brought him the wooden star button. "You keep it," she said, "so you don't forget." Jonah closed his hand around it. "Forget what?" "That I'm yours," she said. Then softer, "And you're mine." Jonah nodded, the room blurring. He understood, with a clarity that hurt and healed at once, that the only lie he had ever told was the one on paper. Everything else, the waiting, the choosing, the staying, was the truest thing he had ever done. The knock came at the wrong hour. Not early enough to be kind, not late enough to be cruel. Just after noon, when the day still pretended to be ordinary. Jonah was rinsing rice at the sink when the sound reached him. 3 measured taps, spaced carefully, as if whoever stood on the other side believed precision could soften what followed. Mara looked up from the table. She did not ask who it was. She watched Jonah's face instead. He dried his hands slowly. He did not rush. Rushing was a confession. "Yes," he called. "County office," a voice answered. "Follow-up review." Jonah opened the door. Ms. Harriet Doyle stood there with a man Jonah had not seen before. He wore a dark coat and held a thin folder pressed flat against his chest. His eyes were not unkind, but they were trained, eyes that had learned to notice what others missed. "This is Mr. Calvin Brooks," Harriet said. "Records and compliance." Jonah nodded. "Come in." The room felt smaller with them inside. Harriet sat where she had sat before. Brooks remained standing, his gaze moving from the stove to the window to the ledger on the table. He did not touch anything. He catalogued. Mara hovered near Jonah's leg, her fingers grazing his coat. "Good afternoon, Mara," Harriet said gently. "Good afternoon," Mara replied, careful and polite. She had learned the tone that made adults less sharp. Brooks opened his folder. "Mr. Shaw," he said, pronouncing the name as if testing its fit. "We're here to verify some records. Routine." Jonah inclined his head. "Of course." "Employment," Brooks said. "Your file shows irregular income." Jonah did not flinch. "I work day labor. It's steady enough." "Addresses?" Brooks asked. "You've listed Hawthorne Street for 6 months." "That's correct." Brooks made a note. "Any relatives come forward?" "No." Harriet watched Jonah's face while Brooks spoke, as if measuring not the answers but the space around them. Jonah answered evenly, keeping his hands visible, his voice calm. He had learned this posture long ago. Brooks turned a page. "We cross-referenced names," he said. "Your name." The room tightened. Jonah felt Mara's fingers curl into his coat. He placed his hand over hers, a small, anchoring pressure. "Elliot Shaw," Brooks continued. "Born—" "Records were damaged," Jonah said softly, finishing the sentence before it could sharpen. "The war." Brooks looked up. "Yes, that's what the file says." Silence, the kind that listens. Brooks closed the folder halfway. "We'll need to run a verification through the central registry. There have been discrepancies." Jonah nodded once. He did not argue. Arguing invited inspection. "How long?" Jonah asked. "Weeks," Brooks said. "Could be months." "And during that time?" Jonah asked, careful. Harriet answered, "Mara remains with you unless cause is found." Mara shifted. "Cause?" Harriet knelt to her level. "It means reasons, sweetheart. We're just checking papers." Mara looked at Jonah. He nodded. She nodded back, the exchange silent and complete. Brooks made one more note. "We'll also need a medical update." Jonah handed over the clinic slip he had kept folded in his wallet. Brooks scanned it, then returned it. "School?" Brooks asked. "Nod." Jonah pointed to the schedule pinned to the wall. "She attends." Brooks glanced at the drawing above it, the crooked house, the 2 figures. He paused. Something softened, almost imperceptibly. "Very well," Brooks said. He closed the folder fully now. "We'll be in touch." They left without shaking hands. When the door closed, Jonah leaned his forehead against the wood and breathed. The room seemed to exhale with him. Mara waited until his shoulders lowered. "Are they taking me?" "No," Jonah said at once. Then, because truth mattered, he added, "Not today." Mara considered this. "Tomorrow?" Jonah knelt. He took her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said. "If anyone ever tries to take you, I will be there. I will say no. I will do everything." She studied his face. Children know when adults are making promises they intend to keep, even if they cannot guarantee the outcome. "Okay," she said. That night, Jonah took out the ledger and added a new column. Central Registry, pending. He understood the risk now more clearly than ever. Paper traveled faster than people. Names left trails. If Elliot Shaw existed anywhere beyond Jonah's careful performance, the system would find him, or fail to. Jonah lay awake listening to Mara's breathing. He imagined the registry's shelves, rows of files, spines faded, truths and errors stacked together until they looked the same. He imagined a clerk pulling a card, frowning, setting it aside. In the morning, Jonah made a decision. He went to the docks and asked for longer hours. He took work that bruised his hands and stiffened his back. He saved coins in a jar and hid it behind the stove. He spoke less at the market. He stopped visiting the diner. He reduced his footprint. He also began to prepare. Not an escape, running would prove guilt, but a defense. He gathered letters from teachers, receipts from the clinic, notes from neighbors who had seen Mara walk to school with him every day. He did not ask them to lie. He asked them to write what they knew. At school, the teacher hesitated, then wrote anyway. Mara arrives clean. She learns quickly. Her father is present. The word father appeared again and again, unchallenged. Weeks passed. Then a letter arrived with the seal of the central registry. Jonah did not open it at once. He set it on the table and made tea. He sat with Mara and watched her draw. He memorized the curve of her concentration, the way she bit her lip when lines went wrong. When he finally opened the letter, his hands were steady. "We regret to inform you." The words blurred. Jonah read them again. The registry could not confirm the existence of Elliot Shaw beyond a military death notice filed overseas. The records were incomplete. Further review required. Further review meant deeper digging. Harriet came 2 days later, alone. She sat and listened as Jonah explained, carefully, truth threaded with silence. He did not confess. He did not invent. He let the facts stand where they could. Harriet closed her folder slowly. "You understand," she said, "that if this proceed, there may be a hearing." Jonah nodded. "I understand." She hesitated. "And the child?" Jonah's voice did not shake. "She stays." Harriet looked at him for a long time. "I can't promise outcomes," she said, "but I can promise to report what I see." "What do you see?" Jonah asked. Harriet glanced toward the table where Mara colored, humming to herself. "I see a child who has not disappeared," Harriet said. "That matters." When she left, Jonah felt the day tilt towards something inevitable. He did not tell Mara everything. He told her enough. "They're asking questions," he said. "We'll answer." Mara nodded. "Together." "Yes," Jonah said. "Together." That night, he took out the box beneath the bed, the pages he had written, the imagined mother, the careful bridge. He added a new page, not for Mara, but for himself. "If they take me apart," he wrote, "let what I built remain." He folded the page and placed it on top. Outside, the city rang with the sound of evening bells. Jonah sat with Mara until sleep took her, then stayed awake, listening for the next knock, because he knew now that the system never knocked, just once. Mara stopped asking questions. It happened the way frost happens, quietly, overnight, without permission. Jonah noticed it first in the mornings. She still dressed herself. She still ate. She still walked to school at his side. But the stream of small curiosities that once filled the air, why this, why that, what happens if, had thinned to a careful silence. Children do not stop wondering. They learn when wondering costs too much. At school, the teacher began sending notes home, not of trouble, but of observation. Mara listens more than she speaks. Mara watches other children before joining. Mara prefers corners. Jonah read the notes and folded them into the ledger. He added nothing. The ledger had become a map of pressure points. Writing more felt like tempting fate. At home, Mara drew. Not houses now, but paths. Thin lines that began in one corner of the page and ended nowhere in particular. Jonah pinned them to the wall anyway. He told himself not to interpret. Interpretation led to panic. One afternoon, while Jonah mended a chair leg, Mara stood beside him and asked a question that was not a question. "Papa," she said, eyes on the floor, "if someone has two names, which one is real?" Jonah's hands stilled. He kept his voice level. "Why do you ask?" Mara shrugged, a small movement. "Just thinking." Jonah tightened the screw. He chose words the way he chose tools, only what was necessary. "Sometimes people use different names for different places," he said. "Work names, home names, old names. Can they forget one?" Mara asked. "No," Jonah said. "Not really." She nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. Then she walked away. That night, Jonah lay awake replaying the exchange, counting what had been said and what had not. He understood then that the danger had shifted. The system was no longer the sharpest blade. Curiosity was. Weeks passed with the quiet insistence of rain. Harriet's visits became brief check-ins. Brooks did not return. Letters arrived and were answered. The central registry remained unresolved. Life continued in a narrow corridor. Then came the envelope without a seal. It was thin, addressed in a careful hand. For Mara Shaw, Jonah stared at it longer than he should have. Mail for children was rare. He turned it over. No return address, no stamp he recognized. Mara noticed. She approached, cautious. "Is it mine?" Jonah nodded. "It says so." She held it with both hands, as if it might break. She did not open it immediately. She looked at Jonah, then back at the envelope. "Can I?" she asked. "Yes," Jonah said. She slid a finger beneath the flap and unfolded a single page. Her eyes moved slowly, sounding out words she had learned only recently. Jonah watched her face change, not fear, not joy, but but recognition. She handed the page to him. The letter was short. Dear Mara, if this reaches you, it means questions are being asked. I cannot answer them for you, but I can tell you this. You were loved before you were found. If you ever need to know where you came from, look to the river by the old mill. Someone remembers. A friend. Jonah's breath caught. He read it again and again. The river by the old mill. He knew the place. Everyone did. It was where the town's memory went to drown. Rusted machinery, weeds, a footbridge that creaked like an apology. Who is it? Mara asked. I don't know, Jonah said. It was the truth, and it frightened him. Is it about me? She asked. Yes, Jonah said. She nodded, absorbing the weight of it. Are we going? The question was the question she had not asked before. Jonah sat. He felt the room tilt, not violently, but decisively. Going meant exposure. Staying meant silence. Silence had protected them so far. Silence had also begun to shrink Mara's world. We can, Jonah said slowly. If you want. Mara looked at the wall where her drawings hung. She looked at the ledger on the table. She looked at Jonah. I want to know, she said. Not loudly, not bravely, just clearly. They went the next morning. The mill stood where it always had, a skeleton by the river's bend. The water moved fast there, choked by spring melt. Jonah held Mara's hand as they crossed the footbridge. The boards groaned beneath their weight. At the far end, someone waited. A woman, older than Jonah, wrapped in a dark coat. Her hair was gray, her face lined not with age but with vigilance. She did not smile when she saw them. She nodded, once. You came, she said. Mara stepped closer to Jonah. Do you know me? The woman's eyes softened. I know of you. She looked at Jonah then, assessing. And you must be Elliot Shaw. Jonah did not correct her. My name is Ruth Calder, the woman said. I worked at the station clinic. That day. Jonah felt the memory surge, the thin blanket, the waiting floor, the child who would not speak. You saw her, Jonah said. Ruth nodded. I saw her mother too. Mara's grip tightened. My mama? Ruth knelt, careful with her knees. Yes, she brought you there. She was sick. Fever, confused. She asked me to watch you while she found help. Did she come back? Mara asked. Ruth's eyes closed briefly. No. Silence stretched, not empty, but full. Ruth continued. They took her to the infirmary. She died that night. Mara did not cry. She did not move. Jonah felt her weight lean into him, anchoring. She told me your name, Ruth said. She told me to make sure someone wrote it down, but when I returned, you were gone. Ruth looked at Jonah. You took her. Jonah nodded. He did not justify. He did not apologize. Good, Ruth said quietly. No one else would. Ruth reached into her coat and produced a small envelope. This was hers, she said, handing it to Mara. She asked me to keep it safe. Inside was a scrap of paper with a name written carefully, as if each letter mattered. Mara. Mara traced the letters with her finger. She looked up at Jonah. She knew. Yes, Jonah said. She knew. Ruth stood. I wrote the letter because the registry asked questions. I thought, you deserve the truth. Jonah nodded. Thank you. Ruth hesitated. They'll keep asking, she said. About him. She meant Elliot. She meant the name. I know, Jonah said. Ruth looked at Mara. Whatever happens, she said, remember this. You were not lost. You were delivered. Mara nodded, solemn. They walked back across the bridge in silence. The river roared beneath them, indifferent and alive. At home, Mara placed the scrap of paper in the box beneath the bed. She added her wooden star button. She closed the lid. That night, she came to Jonah's floor pallet and lay beside him. Papa, she whispered, what's your other name? Jonah closed his eyes. Jonah, he said. Mara smiled, small and sure. I like it. Jonah breathed out, the truth settling between them like a held note. He understood now that the system would not be the one to tear them apart if it came to that. The hardest work would be standing still when the truth finally asked to be seen. The hearing room smelled like old varnish and patience. It was smaller than Jonah expected. No gallery, no raised bench, just a long table, 3 chairs on one side, 2 on the other, and a clerk with a stack of folders that looked heavy enough to bruise. The walls were bare except for a calendar that still showed last month, as if even time had grown tired of updating itself. Mara sat beside Jonah, feet not touching the floor, hands folded in her lap. She wore the blue sweater he had mended twice already. Her hair was neat. Her face was calm in the careful way calmness sometimes is when it has been rehearsed. Across from them sat Mr. Calvin Brooks and a woman Jonah had not met before, Ms. Elaine Porter, counsel for the county. Ms. Harriet Doyle sat near the clerk, her folder closed, her expression unreadable. The clerk cleared her throat. "This is a preliminary review regarding the guardianship of Mara Shaw," she said. "Purpose: verification of identity and determination of next steps." Next steps. Jonah felt the phrase settle like a weight. Ms. Porter leaned forward. "Mr. Shaw," she said, crisp and professional, "we have received information that raises questions about your legal identity." Jonah nodded. "I understand. You signed documents under the name Elliot Shaw," Ms. Porter continued. "The Central Registry cannot verify that identity beyond a death notice filed overseas. Can you explain?" Jonah's hands rested open on the table. He had learned long ago that hiding them made men nervous. "The records were destroyed," he said. "The war." Ms. Porter tilted her head. "Destroyed records do not typically erase entire lives." "No," Jonah said, "they don't." Silence followed, not accusatory, just attentive. Ms. Porter slid a paper across the table. "We also received a statement from a third party," she said. "Ms. Ruth Calder." Harriet's eyes flicked up at the name, then back down. Jonah felt Mara's shoulder press into his arm. He did not look at her. He did not need to. Ms. Porter read, "Ms. Calder confirms the child's mother died the night the child was found. She confirms the child's name. She confirms you removed the child from the station." Jonah nodded. "Yes. And," Ms. Porter added, "she indicates you were not the child's biological father." Jonah met her gaze. "No." The word rang clean. Ms. Porter folded her hands. "Then why did you claim paternity?" Jonah inhaled slowly. He did not look at Mara. He spoke to the room, to the ledger, to the paper that had already decided so much. "Because a child without a guardian disappears," he said. "Because there was no one else. Because paperwork moves faster than mercy." Mr. Brooks shifted. "You admit you falsified documents." Jonah did not flinch. "I admit I signed them." Ms. Porter's pen hovered. "Under a false name." Jonah closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Yes." Mara stirred. Ms. Porter glanced at her. "Mara," she said gently, "do you understand why we're here?" Mara nodded. "To ask about names? And do you know this man is not your biological father?" Mara's voice was steady. "Yes." A pause. "And you still live with him?" "Yes." "Do you want to continue living with him?" Ms. Porter asked. Mara looked at Jonah then, not for permission, not for reassurance, but as if anchoring herself to something solid. Then she looked back at Ms. Porter. "Yes," she said. "He stayed." The words were simple. They were devastating. Ms. Porter leaned back. She looked at Brooks. Brooks looked at Harriet. Harriet looked at the table, then up. "I visited the home," Harriet said quietly, "multiple times. The child is safe. She is cared for. She attends school. She is present." Mr. Brooks cleared his throat. "Safety is not the only criterion," he said. "Identity matters. Law matters." "It does," Harriet agreed. "But so does outcome." Ms. Porter tapped her pen. "Mr. Shaw," she paused, corrected herself. "Mr. Mercer." Jonah's heart stuttered. Ms. Porter's voice remained even. "We know your real name." Jonah nodded once. "I assumed you would." "You took a dead man's identity," Ms. Porter said. "That is a serious offense." "Yes," Jonah said, "it is." Mara's fingers found his hand beneath the table. He laced his fingers through hers. Ms. Porter continued, "You did not attempt to profit. You did not attempt to evade justice for a prior crime. You did not attempt to traffic the child. You attempted to secure guardianship." Jonah said nothing. Ms. Porter turned a page. "Under extraordinary circumstances, the court may consider intent and outcome. There is precedent." Brooks stiffened. "Precedent does not excuse fraud." "No," Ms. Porter said, "but it can contextualize it." She looked at Mara. "Mara, can you tell us who Jonah Mercer is to you?" Mara did not hesitate. "He's my father." Ms. Porter raised an eyebrow. Even knowing, Mara said, firm now, "he's my father." The clerk wrote quickly. Ms. Porter folded her hands. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "why didn't you come forward once the child was safe?" Jonah answered honestly. Because safety without permanence is still fear. Because once I stopped, the system would take over. And the system does not raise children. People do. Silence. Ms. Porter closed her folder. Here is what will happen, she said. We will suspend the fraud proceedings contingent upon compliance. You will submit to identity verification under your true name. You will petition for guardianship under that name. The child will remain in your care during the process. Jonah's breath released in a way he could not control. Ms. Porter continued. There will be conditions, monitoring, review. I accept, Jonah said. Brooks frowned. And the name Elliot Shaw? Ms. Porter's gaze sharpened. Will be retired. Jonah nodded. He felt something in his chest loosen, a knot he had been tightening every day. Harriet spoke then, softly. Mara will need counseling support. Jonah nodded. Yes. Ms. Porter stood. This is not an absolution, she said to Jonah. It is a recognition that sometimes the law arrives late to a human decision already made. She gathered her papers. We will reconvene in 60 days. The clerk stamped the record. The sound echoed. Outside, the sky was bright in a way that felt almost rude. Jonah and Mara stood on the steps of the building. Jonah felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Is it over? Mara asked. No, Jonah said. But it's changing. She nodded. I like changing. They walked home slowly. At the door, Jonah paused. He reached into his coat and pulled out the ledger. He tore out a page, the first page, the one where Elliot Shaw had been written in careful ink. He folded it and held it over the stove flame. The paper darkened, curled, vanished. Mara watched, solemn. Goodbye, she said. Yes, Jonah said. Goodbye. That night, Jonah wrote his real name at the top of a clean page, Jonah Mercer. Below it, he wrote one line, I chose to stay. He closed the ledger. Chapter 9. 1,000 words. The name she chose. The 60 days did not pass like time usually passes. They passed like weather, some days clear, some days heavy, with a pressure that made Jonah's joints ache and Mara's shoulders rise toward her ears. The city learned summer. Windows opened. The bakery downstairs finally emptied of its old smell and filled with the dust of renovation. Life kept leaning forward, even when the past tugged at its sleeve. Under Jonah's true name, things became both simpler and harder. Forms were corrected. Records were amended. The clerk at the county office raised an eyebrow, then stamped anyway. Harriet's visits resumed, less frequent now, more conversational. A counselor came on Wednesdays and spoke to Mara with the careful patience of someone who knew that children did not need fixing, only room. What do you feel when you hear your name? The counselor asked once. Mara thought, which one? Either. Mara smiled, small and serious. Both are me. Jonah learned that truth could widen rather than collapse a life. He also learned that truth asked for payment up front. Work came slower under his real name. Some doors preferred the dead man who left no trace. He took what he could, refused what he must, and kept the jar behind the stove growing, coin by coin. The letter arrived on a Friday. Final review scheduled. Jonah read it at the table while Mara colored beside him. He did not hide it. He did not dramatize it. Court? Mara asked. Yes, Jonah said. Do I need my blue sweater? She asked. He smiled. If you want. I want, she said, and kept coloring. The hearing this time was different. A judge sat at the head of the table, a woman with silver hair and eyes that did not waste time. Ms. Porter was there. Brooks was not. Harriet sat closer to Jonah and Mara than before. The judge read quietly for a long time. Papers rustled. The room breathed. Mr. Mercer, the judge said at last, you assumed a false identity to claim guardianship of a minor. Yes, Jonah said. You did so without personal gain, the judge continued. You did so in a context of immediate risk to the child. You maintained care, education, and stability. You corrected the record when compelled. Jonah nodded. The words felt heavier when spoken aloud. The judge turned to Mara. Mara, she said, kindly but plainly, do you know why you're here? Yes, Mara said, to say who I live with. And who is that? Mara did not look at Jonah. She did not need to. Jonah Mercer, she said. The judge's eyebrow lifted slightly. Not father, Mara thought. He is my father, she said, but that's not a name. The judge smiled. just a little. And do you choose to remain with him? Yes, Mara said. I choose. The word landed with the authority of something learned slowly. Ms. Porter spoke then, brief and precise. Harriet added her observations. The counselor's report was read into the record. Stability, attachment, progress. The judge closed the file. Guardianship is not blood, she said. It is work. It is presence. It is choosing, again and again. She looked at Jonah. Mr. Mercer, the court grants permanent guardianship. Jonah felt the room tilt, not from fear this time, but from release. He closed his eyes for one heartbeat and opened them. The judge raised a finger. With one condition. Jonah nodded. Anything. Mara's name, the judge said. She may retain Shaw if she wishes, or she may choose another. The room stilled. Jonah felt his chest tighten, not with dread, but with respect. This was Mara's turn. Mara stood on her chair to be seen. She held the wooden star button in her palm. She did not rush. I want to keep Mara, she said first, as if there had ever been doubt. The judge smiled. Of course, Mara continued. I want Shaw because my mama knew it. She paused, then added, and I want Mercer because Jonah chose me. A murmur moved through the room, soft, approving. The judge nodded. Then it will be recorded. She stamped the paper. The sound was not a door slamming this time. It was a door opening. Outside, the air was warm. Summer had learned the street. Jonah and Mara stood on the steps, not sure what to do with their hands now that there was nothing left to sign. What now? Mara asked. Jonah thought. He thought of the ledger, now thinner, of the jar, heavier, of the box beneath the bed with its careful bridges, of the old mill and the river that remembered. Now, he said, we go home. They walked, not fast, not slow, together. At home, Jonah took the ledger to the table. He did not tear out pages. He did not burn them. He wrote one final entry. Identity corrected. Guardianship granted. Name chosen. Mara climbed onto the chair beside him. She watched him write. Can I? She asked. Yes, Jonah said, and slid the pen across. She wrote carefully beneath his line, letters deliberate and proud. Mara Shaw, Mercer. She set the pen down. That's me, she said. Yes, Jonah said. That's you. That night, Jonah placed the ledger back on the shelf. He took the box from beneath the bed and set it on the table. He opened it. The pages rustled softly, like leaves. Mara looked inside. We keep it? She asked. We keep it, Jonah said. It's part of how we got here, she nodded. Stories don't disappear. No, Jonah said. They change hands. Later, when Mara slept, Jonah stood at the window. The city breathed. Somewhere, a train passed without stopping. He thought of the station, the blank line, the borrowed name. He felt the weight lift and leave a shape behind. A scar, not a wound. In the morning, they would wake and do ordinary things. School, work, soup, bread. Ordinary would be their miracle now. Jonah turned from the window and lay down. He slept. And in sleep for the first time in years, he did not listen for knocks. Morning arrived without ceremony. Light slid across the floor in a pale ribbon and rested at the edge of Mara's bed. Jonah woke before the city did, not from habit this time, but from the unfamiliar ease of it, sleep that had not been cut short by listening. He lay still, letting the quiet settle. The room breathed with him. No envelopes waited on the table, no ledgers needed guarding, no borrowed names pressed against his ribs. Mara woke a few minutes later and sat up, hair a small storm. She looked at him as if checking a map. Papa, she said, then corrected herself with a smile. Jonah, he smiled back. Good morning. Is it real? She asked. Yes, Jonah said. It's real. They moved through the morning with a gentleness that surprised them both. Bread toasted, water boiled, shoes tied. The ordinary acts carried a new weight, not obligation, but choice. Jonah walked Mara to school and felt the old glances soften into something like familiarity. The teacher waved. A child called Mara's name, both of them, and she turned easily, answering to herself. At the gate, Mara paused. You'll be here, she said. It was not a question. I will, Jonah said. She nodded and went inside. Jonah took the long way home. He walked past the diner with the fogged windows, past the county office with its narrow doors, past the station where the clock still read 2:17. He stood there a moment, watching people move. No one cried on the floor today. Or perhaps someone did, and the sound was swallowed by steam and hurry. Jonah felt the familiar tug, the knowledge that the world did not pause because one story found its ending. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the wooden star button. He smiled, then turned toward Hawthorne Street. The bakery downstairs was open again by afternoon. The owner nodded at Jonah and handed him a warm roll without comment. Jonah paid anyway. Paying mattered now. It marked a life no longer built on erasure. That evening, Mara brought home a paper from school. A simple thing. A family tree assignment, boxes and lines, clean and expectant. She spread it on the table. "We can do it," she said, "if you want." Jonah studied the page. He saw the old ache stir. Not pain exactly, but memory. "We can," he said, "but we'll do it our way." They sat together and filled in what they could. Names where names were known. Blanks where blanks belonged. No inventions, no apologies. At the top, Mara wrote her name carefully. Mara Shaw Mercer. Below it, she drew 2 lines. One led to Mother. She wrote nothing there, then drew a small star. The other led to Guardian. She wrote Jonah Mercer and added a second star just to be safe. "It looks different," she said. "It's honest," Jonah said. She nodded. "Honest looks like space." They pinned the paper to the wall beside the drawings of paths. The house reappeared later, crooked and earnest. But this time the path ended at a door that stood open. Weeks passed. Harriet's visits tapered off, then stopped. The counselor signed her final note and shook Jonah's hand. Work came and went, modest and sufficient. The jar behind the stove filled and emptied and filled again. Summer learned to lean toward autumn. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed simply, "Jonah Mercer, no seal, no demand." Inside was a note from Ms. Ruth Calder. "I heard the decision. I am glad. I thought you should know. The registry closed the file. The mother's effects were archived. There was nothing else with her name. I think she would be relieved." Jonah folded the note and placed it in the box beneath the bed, on top of the pages he had written in the dark. He did not add to them now. The bridge had done its work. On the first cool evening of fall, Jonah and Mara walked to the river by the old mill. Leaves skated along the water's surface. The footbridge creaked, apologetic as ever. They stood where Ruth had stood months before. Mara held the star button in her palm. "Can we leave it?" she asked. "If you want," Jonah said. She knelt and placed the button on the railing. It caught the light for a moment, then rolled and fell, vanishing into the rush. Mara watched the water. "She knows," she said. "Yes," Jonah said. "She knows." They walked home as dusk gathered. At the door, Mara stopped and looked up at him. "Jonah," she said, careful with the word, "if someone asks who you are to me..." He waited. "What should I say?" Jonah considered the distance they had traveled, the station floor, the clipboard, the false ink, the knocks, the hearings, the stamped paper that finally sounded like welcome. He considered the small daily work that had made a life out of all of it. "Say whatever is true for you," he said. Mara smiled. "Okay." That night, Jonah took the ledger from the shelf for the last time. He opened it to the first page, the page where Elliot Shaw had once lived. He did not tear it out. He wrote across it, clean and final, closed. He turned the page and wrote one sentence at the end of the book. "I chose to stay, and she chose me." He closed the ledger and set it beside the box. He did not put it away. Some things deserved to be visible. Later, when the city had settled and the bakery's lights were out, Jonah lay on the floor and listened to Mara breathe. He thought of the question that had once terrified him, the one that had hung between them like a blade. Who are you? The answer had not arrived all at once. It had been built day by day, out of soup and bread, signatures corrected, names spoken and unspoken, truth told when it could be carried. Jonah closed his eyes. In the morning, they would wake and do ordinary things. And in those ordinary things, the extraordinary would remain. Not loud, not rewarded, not recorded in any archive that mattered. Just a man and a child who had found a way to keep each other. And a name, finally, that no longer needed borrowing.